last week we started a brand new series, What in This World Are We Going to Do? And I wanted to take a moment over the next couple of weeks to kind of address some of the craziness in life and the things that are happening in the world. Last week we talked about avoiding the election infection and the whole thing surrounding politics and all the stuff that's going on there. I'm kind of curious, as you watch the news or you see the headlines and things going on in your news, they're talking about ISIS, they're talking about the president of China or the president of Russia or our elections or the famines, the diseases, all the stuff kind of going on, the whole Zika virus. How many of you just watch all this and just honestly, there's kind of a little twinge of fear that goes through your mind? Anybody here? All right, 7 people. That's great. Yay. Well, let's just wrap up because I don't have anything else to say to you this morning. So I think there's this element of fear inside of all of us when we talk about some of these things in the world. Let me ask you this. When you hear the term Christian, what thoughts, what emotions come to your mind when you think about Christian? When you think about Christianity and the world around you and the church and the people inside of the church, what thoughts come to your mind? And I know there's a flurry of thoughts that might come to your mind. If you're not a follower of Christ, maybe you're here today, you're just observing, you're a guest, whatever the reason you might be here, you've already got a preconceived idea of what a Christian is. But let me tell you what I think a Christian ought to be. Let me tell you about the emotion that I think it should evoke when somebody hears the term Christian. Wow. They are the most fearless people I have ever met. It seems like it doesn't matter how crazy things get in their life. It doesn't matter how crazy things are in the world. They just are steady. They're just rocks. They're not moved by any of that kind of stuff. It's just amazing. And I think one of the reasons that we should feel this fearlessness as followers of Christ is because we look to Jesus, the one that endured the cross. We look at everything that Jesus went through and we go, you know what? Jesus did it. It's like he's the first one to cross the finish line. If he can do it, we can do it. We know why we're doing what we're doing. When we look at stuff in the world today, let's just be honest. When we look at things in the world today, uncertainty is certain. And that's the world that we live in, isn't it? Everything around you is uncertain. You don't know what's going to happen tomorrow. You can check your device. You can check out the headlines right now, see what's going on in the world. Uncertainty is certain, but fear is an option. Uncertainty is certain, but fear is an option. You have the choice over whether you're going to live your life fearlessly or fearful. When you think about Christians in the first century, we read about Christianities that got off the ground in the book of Acts. And when you read about the first century Christians, they didn't know where it was going to go. But they knew what it was to be excommunicated, to be persecuted, to be flogged, to be imprisoned, to be beaten, to be jeered, all of these things. But they persevered because they believed so strongly in this man, Jesus Christ, who was put to death on a cross and raised again. It didn't matter what was going on in the world. Nothing was going to shake their faith. They didn't fear losing anything. And you know what? When you're not afraid of losing anything, you become courageous, compassionate, and generous. Because you're not afraid of losing anything. And that's the way I would love for all of us to be in this world, that when people think about Christians, they just go, wow, wow. There's such a sense of awe. Wow, I just can't believe how they're not shaken by anything. That when Christians walk in the room, maybe there's a desperate or a dire situation, and you being a follower of Jesus Christ, the moment you walked in the room, everybody in the room goes, yay, you're here. We're so glad that you're here. Because you just seem to have a peace that we don't have in the midst of the stuff that we're facing right now. One of the people that I had the privilege of speaking into my life was a part of this church. He's gone on to be with Jesus. He's at home with God. He was in World War II. He was an infantryman in the country of Europe. He would spend time in the downtimes reading the Bible and praying, and people, the other soldiers, gave him such a hard time about being a Christian. And yet, there was something about Marvin that was different, because when the bombs were dropping and the ammunition is flying all over the place, you know who wanted to be in Marvin's foxhole? Everybody. Because Marvin was safe and there was a security and he was anchored to something that they weren't. That he had this courage in the midst of fear that none of the rest of them had. The question that we have to answer today is, well, what happened to us? What went wrong? Why is it that we as believers can feel the same sense of fear as the people around us in the world that we live in? When we look at all the stuff happening in our current events and in the news and in politics and elections, just the whole gamut of things, how is it that we as a church can feel the same sense of panic and, oh no, what are we going to do if they become the president or the leader or whatever the case might be? Where do we go wrong with all that? Where do we go wrong and suddenly have this sense of fear? Jesus might say to us this morning, have you forgotten what I did for you? Did you forget what I endured so that you can have what you have on this Sunday morning? Do you know the privilege we have to sit in this air-conditioned building in a free United States and worship God without having to look over our shoulders or be afraid of found out? Somebody lived their life fearlessly so that we can enjoy what we enjoy right now in this moment, on this day. Fearless people. And let me tell you something, graduates, it's a generation like your own, that started out a couple of thousand years ago that said, I don't care what goes on. I know who I believe in. It's Jesus. He's real, and I'm passionate, I'm sold out, and I'm courageous, and nothing's going to stop me from moving that direction. They impacted a generation. In fact, we're here today because of the impact those people had way back then. We're going to look at the book of Hebrews. I love the book of Hebrews. If ever there was a book to read from on Memorial Day, if we're remembering great people, it's found in Hebrews chapters 11 and 12. So we're going to read there in Hebrews. We don't know who wrote Hebrews for sure, but in Hebrews chapter 11 and 12, they kind of visit some things that were foundational to our faith. They were looking at Christianity. The first century Christians, they had no idea where Christianity was going to go. They didn't know that there would be millions of believers on planet Earth still today, 2,000 years later. They didn't know what was going to happen. And the book of Hebrews kind of looks at things and says, is Christianity working and is it worth it? And so in Hebrews chapter 11, we're going to start in chapter 11, verse number 1. We call this the faith chapter. This is probably one of the most misinterpreted, misunderstood verses. And we're going to read some things, and I want to rally you to a cause today. I want to rally you to encouragement, to know that there is nothing in this world that we should be afraid of. We should not be afraid of the President of the United States, whomever that will be. We shouldn't fear the President of China or the President of Russia. We shouldn't fear ISIS. We shouldn't fear an economic meltdown. We shouldn't fear any kind of virus or superbug, because there's a God that has it all in control, and he knows what's going on, and he's written it all into his great plan. So let's look at Hebrews chapter 11, verse number 1. Sorry to holler so much at you. Just get excited about what I'm talking about. If you'd like, I could stand in one place and just talk like this for half an hour. Hebrews chapter 11, verse number 1. Let's talk about faith. Faith shows the reality of what we hope for. Faith is showing the reality of what we hope for. It is the evidence of things that we cannot see. Let me explain it to you like this. If ever you have had a job, and I think most of us in this room have had a job, and you sat down with the employer and there was an agreement about what you were going to get paid on a monthly basis, weekly basis, hourly basis, whatever it is, on the day that you started your job, he or she did not give you a paycheck for the hours you didn't work yet. You worked for those hours. You worked 1 week, you worked 2 weeks, you worked for a month before you saw the paycheck. You believed that at the end of that time there was going to be a paycheck waiting for you. You didn't see it. There was no proof. You had to trust the person that hired you that you're going to get a paycheck. You know what faith is? I haven't seen what God's going to do for me yet, but I know it's going to happen because he is more trustworthy than any employer on planet Earth. Okay? And then you got this piece of paper. You think about a paycheck, it's a piece of paper with ink on it. Like, what good is that? So you expressed more faith when you took that piece of paper to the bank, you signed the back of it, and they gave you some cash. And then you put faith in some more pieces of paper mixed in with some cotton called currency or cash, and you took it to the store and you spent it, assuming that there was something backing the value of that money. You express faith all the time. It's just that nobody ever explained it to you that way. He goes on in verse number 2. Through their faith, the people in the days of old, they earned a good reputation. Now, he's going to go back and talk about some biblical historical figures a little bit. And they got a good reputation, not by the inventions they made, not by the books that they wrote. It was by the way they lived their life and the way they trusted God. They got a good reputation. He gives us some Old Testament examples. He starts out with a guy named Abel. He talks about Enoch. He talks about Abraham and Sarah and Noah, the guy that built the big ark. God gave them a promise, and they believed in the promise, living every day. Just imagine this. They lived every day like God could be trusted. Imagine if you lived every day like God could be trusted every day. Just imagine if every need, everything that pressed you, everything that worried you, everything that scared you, you just believe, well, I can trust God. Just imagine if you started to live your life as if God could be trusted every day for everything. And that's what these people did. That's what these people did. A guy like Abraham, One time God says to Abraham, come here. Come on outside. Come on, Abraham. And Abraham stands outside, and God says, look up in the stars in the sky. So Abraham's looking up there, and he sees all the stars, and God says, you see all those stars? One day, you're going to have descendants that outnumber all those stars. To which Abraham could have said, that's great. Have you noticed that all I have in my tent is my wife and no children, and I am an old man? I'm an old man. He didn't see the fulfillment of the promise. But later in the New Testament, the Apostle Paul says, if you're a follower of Jesus Christ, you're a child of Abraham. You're a part of the promise. Abraham never saw it, but he believed it. He believed that God could be trusted in every one of those circumstances. He goes on in Hebrews chapter 11, verse number 13. All these people they died still believing what God had promised them. They did not receive what was promised, but they saw it from a distance and they welcomed it. You know, they didn't know that it was going to happen, but they believed it was going to happen. And they still stayed faithful to God. They still stayed faithful to God. You know what? You know what we do? We pray a prayer on Monday, and if God hasn't answered our prayer by Thursday, we give up. Some people do that. They're so discouraged with God. I prayed for somebody to be healed. I prayed for them to be delivered. I prayed for money. I prayed for the job. I prayed for this, and God didn't show up, and so I'm done with God. And here, the writer of Hebrews is saying these people didn't see the answer to their prayer, but they trusted Him anyway. They just stuck to it all the way through the whole thing. The Old Testament people never saw the answer, but they trusted God. He goes on in verse number 35. Others were tortured, refusing to turn from God in order to be set free. They placed their hope in a better life after the resurrection. That's why I talk about heaven Sunday after Sunday after Sunday after Sunday after Sunday. I talk about heaven because I think there's a better life. If this is all the better it gets, let's quit and go home, right? He goes on to say in verse 36, some were jeered at, and their backs were cut open with whips. Others were chained in prisons. Let me tell you, how was your week this last week? Bet you wasn't like that, was it? And yet they stayed faithful and true to God. Verse 37, some died by stoning, some were sawed in half, others were killed with a sword, some went about wearing skins of sheep and goats to school. They wore sheepskins to school. Can you imagine what that was like? I'm just being facetious. Sorry about that whole thing, okay? Sheepskins, goats, they were destitute and oppressed and mistreated. And then it's as if he's just talked about all the things that they endured and they stayed faithful and true to God, not fearing anything. And then it's like the writer of Hebrews took a big pause and thought about these persons. I mean, he just imagined them in his mind. And then he puts his pen back down to the paper and he writes the next verse. They were too good. They were too good for this world. Too good for this world. Another version of the Bible says the world was not worthy of them. They were amazing people that when they walked into the room, people went, wow, 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 wow. And yet, if you would have interviewed any one of them, Abel, Noah, Abraham, David, if you would have interviewed any of them, they would have said, I don't know, I'm just an ordinary person. I just know that I can believe God and I can trust God. They wouldn't have seen themselves as great. They wouldn't have even had their names written in the book of Hebrews. But they just said, I just trust God and I know that God can be believed because they trusted God. There was once a version of faith in Christianity that knew no fear and was absolutely fearless, that when they walked in the room, they were just in awe of the people that walked in, fearing nothing. Fearing nothing. They moved ahead even though they didn't have the promise. Now, you think about David and Goliath. We all know the story about David and Goliath. But the Bible doesn't say, you know what David did? David didn't go and he didn't pray and he didn't fast for a week and say, oh God, what should I do about this giant? There was no conversation between David and God that God didn't say, well, David, here's what you're going to do. You're going to pick up a rock. In fact, why don't you get 5 of them just in case the first one doesn't work? And I'm going to kill that giant. But David knew that God could be trusted. He puts the rocks in his pocket, gets out his slingshot, and he runs towards the giant, and he sinks the rock in his head. He knocks him down and cuts off his head. I think about a guy named Daniel who was thrown into a den of lions. Now, God didn't come to Daniel one day and say, look, Daniel, here's the deal. You're going to have to stand up for what you believe in because you're praying for me, that whole thing, and your convictions, but you're going to get thrown into a den of lions. Yeah, I know that sounds bad, but I'm going to close the mouths of the lions. He didn't have that promise, but he knew that God could be trusted. And that night he had a furry pillow when he slept on a lion. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, these three guys thrown into a fiery furnace. God didn't say, okay, look, stand up for your faith, and here's what's going to happen. I'm going to protect you. I'll be waiting for you on the other side when you get in the furnace. They didn't have the promise, but they knew that God could be trusted, and they knew how much they loved the one they trusted. And they went in, and they had a miracle to tell as a result. Verse number 39, all these people earned a good reputation because of their faith, and yet none of them received that which God had promised. What about you? What about me? Would we still remain faithful even though we haven't yet received the promise? And then verse number 40, he kind of ties it all together. In verse 40, he says, for God had something better in mind for us so that they would not reach perfection without us. This is kind of linking the past with the future. This is like telling you and me today, look what they went through. Look what they did. They feared nothing. You can do this too. And then he goes on with this amazing, amazing statement in chapter 12, verse number 1. Verse number 1, he says, therefore, since we are surrounded by such a huge crowd of witnesses, it's like all of these guys are in the stands, watching the way you live your life, looking at the things you have to endure, looking at the things that are going on in the world environment right now, in our economy and all the powers that be, and they're watching the way you interact with all of that stuff, and they're on the sidelines going, yeah, and they're just cheering you on. And he says, since they're cheering us on and they're watching us, you know what we're supposed to do? We're supposed to stockpile food, build bomb shelters, whine, complain, blame, get the right president in office, and hold on till Jesus comes. Because we think that's how we're going to solve our current problems, isn't it? Can you imagine? Could we just talk? Let's make fun of ourselves for just a little bit here. Can you imagine Christians in Syria right now who are being martyred for their faith? Can you imagine how embarrassed you'd feel and I'd feel if they heard the contents of our prayers? Oh God, please let me be safe on my trip. Oh God, please bless my job. Oh God, I need a raise. Oh God, please let my kids get into this college. Oh God, please let me get a parking spot close to the front door. And they're fighting for their life. Just like the people that we read about in Hebrews chapter 11, chapter 12. Do we have any idea the price that people have paid so that you and I could worship in this building today? This is what we're supposed to do when we feel like we want to give up and we're afraid and we don't know what to do. You know what we're supposed to do? He goes on in that same verse. Look what he says. Let us strip off every weight. There's a lot of weights in our life. There's the weight of worry. There's the weight of fear. There's the weight of regret and sin and grudges. I mean, there's all kinds of weights. He said, let's strip off all those weights that slow us down, especially the sin that so easily ties us up. In other words, you know what? When we're scared and things are going on in this world and we wish that we could change things to make it more comfortable for us, you know what he says? Instead of looking to others to make you feel at ease and to feel peace and calm, you know what we got to do? Instead of looking to others, we got to look to ourselves. We got to go to the mirror and say, what do I need to change about me that I'm more stable, more secure, and more anchored to my Lord and Savior, Jesus Christ? We got to look in the mirror instead of looking around us. That's what he's saying. What's holding you back from following Jesus fearlessly? All of us have to answer that question. He goes on to say in that same verse, and let us run with endurance the race that God has set before us. Let me just say something to all of you. All of you have your individual race. It's not somebody else's race. It's your race. Graduates, the adventure begins. You're beginning a race right now. God has put you on a race course in this culture for this time to influence it, to impact it. And it's not for the adults. It's not for the grown-ups. It's for this generation. It's for you specifically. It's for me. It's my race. God has put you and me on a specific race course to be the influencers, to come into that race without any kind of fear and run it, to just run that race. It's yours specifically. And how do we do this? Because you know what? Let me just be honest with you. I mean, just look at this physique. Does running look like it's a core value for me? No. We want to give up. I mean, running has never been a core value for me. If a wild four-footed animal is not chasing you, there's no purpose in running. Let's just be honest. Unless you're running the race of faith. He goes on to say in verse 2, we do this by keeping our eyes on Jesus. It's as if Jesus has crossed the finish line for us. And there's all these things that want to distract us, pull us aside. We've got fear. We've got fear of ISIS and fear of Zika virus and the fear of the economy and the fear of losing this and the fear of losing all of those kinds of things. Jesus says, no, look. If you look at those things, you're gonna be afraid. You'll never finish the race. If you're a runner and you know the whole track thing, it's always straight ahead. You never look over your shoulders. Isn't that right? You never look over your shoulders. You always look straight ahead. Because that's where Jesus is in this race. He's the champion who initiates and perfects our faith. You know what we tend to do? Look. If you're like me, we tend to keep our eyes on the wrong stuff. In fact, we keep our eyes on stuff. Our eyes are on the fear of losing the things that we think bring us security and safety. We're thinking about what we could lose. We're thinking about losing our stuff, our safety, and our security. We're thinking, in all honesty, if the right person isn't in office, it's a change in my personal economy. It might change the way I live. Isn't it just being honest? Aren't we afraid that we might lose our home, our well-being, we're just afraid of losing stuff. And if we get the right person in office and the right laws and right policies are all implemented, I can live as comfortably as I possibly want to in this life until Jesus comes. Hallelujah. I mean, that's what we think about, isn't it? All of us in this room. Remember what your fearless Jesus did for you when he went to the cross. They didn't have to form a posse and go hunt Jesus down in some foreign country to bring him back to be crucified. They knew exactly where to find Jesus. He was in the garden praying. They knew where to find Jesus. They didn't have to chase him down. Can you imagine? Just think with me for a minute. If every person in the entire world, we could just narrow it down to the United States. If every person in the United States who calls themselves a follower of Jesus Christ, a Christian, lived fearlessly for one day, what do you think it would look like in the United States of America? What would it look like if we just lived fearlessly for a day? Just for one day. He goes on to say in that same verse, he says, look, because of the joy waiting for him, Jesus, because of the joy waiting for him, look, he knew that life here on earth wasn't all it. He knew there was something better. Because of that joy, he endured the cross, disregarding its shame. You know the thing about the cross? It wasn't just the pain. It wasn't just the pain, it was the shame that went along with hanging on the cross. The cross was the worst possible way to die. It was for the insurrectionists. It was for the rebellious. It was for the lowest of the low of the criminals. And it wasn't that they would hang you high up on the cross so that all could see you. They hung you down low to the ground so that people who wanted to come look at you eye to eye and shame you some more. There's a reason you're hanging on that cross, just like the Pharisees did to Jesus. You know what? You saved all these other people. Looking them in the eye, you save yourself if you're really the Messiah. Jesus knew what it was to see that shame. I'm sure living in a Roman-occupied Israel, Jesus had maybe witnessed other persecutions, other crucifixions. He'd witnessed it himself. He knew the smell of death. He knew the sound of the groans and the cries that went up from those crosses. He'd grown up around it, and he knew at one point in time that eventually that would become his destiny. But he knew that it was only temporary compared to the life that was coming still ahead for him. And while he endured that shame, it goes on to say in that same verse, now Jesus is seated at the place of honor beside God's throne. And then he says in verse number 3, think of all the hostility that he endured from sinful people, and then you won't become weary. Then you won't become weary and give up. In other words, the moment you want to get weary and give up and just get tired of the whole thing, think about what Jesus did to get you where you are right here. Now let me talk to you for a little bit. Let me talk to you for a little bit. Some of you have grown weary. Let me just talk to a couple of different age categories in here. If you're 45 and older, don't look around and speculate, okay? If you're 45 and older, let me just talk to you for just a moment. If some of you have honestly, you've grown weary, haven't you? You watch the news channels. I'm just telling you, there's nothing encouraging about watching. I mean, I like to be informed, but not indoctrinated. Some of you are indoctrinated by the news, you 45 and uppers. You're watching it, and you just watch it, and it discourages you. Oh, the good old days. I remember when Reagan was president. Boy, he'd never put up with that stuff. If we just only had the right laws in place and the right policies in place and, God willing, the right president in place, everything would work out okay. But I'll tell you what, the way the world is going right now, when I watch the news, I'm just telling you, we're just going over the edge. You know what? If that's you, would you stop it? You're scaring the kids. Just stop it. That's not encouraging at all. Look, these laws and policies, they all matter, but they don't matter as much as faith. They don't matter as much as faith. You know why I think we can go back to 1973, the whole Roe versus Wade thing? Do you know why I think Roe versus Wade passed? Because the church retreated in fear inside the four walls of its church and decided the biggest issues that we have to deal with is, should we wear jeans to church? Should we allow long hair? And can girls wear makeup? And they missed it. They missed it. They retreated in fear and got disinvolved from all those things. I think that's what happened. You know what? Let me just tell you something. If you're 45 and older, just hang on for a little bit. You know what? If you read the Christmas story, there's a guy in there named Caesar Augustus. You know what Caesar did? When he found out that Jesus was born and everybody thought he was going to be the next king, the insecurity of Caesar, he went out and had all the little boys aged 2 and older, or 2 and younger, killed. That's in the Christmas story. Do you know why Caesar's in the Christmas story? Because God put him in the Christmas story. God had a plan. Do you know on Easter when we read about Jesus and the whole crucifixion, there's a guy named Pontius Pilate. We read about him in the story. And Pontius Pilate was ultimately the one that had said thumbs up or thumbs down. He's the one that had the authority to put Jesus on the cross, humanly speaking. Do you know why Pontius Pilate's in the Easter story? Because God put him in the story. You know what that tells me? God's in control. You know what? You and I are not going to mess up God's plan through the election process on November 8th. Aren't you glad for that? I'm so glad that ISIS is not going to dictate and determine what happens on planet Earth. God is. I'm so glad that Putin, and I can't even pronounce China's president's name, they're not going to determine what's going on in the world. God is going to determine what's going on in the world. Now, if you're under 45, let me talk to you for a little bit. If you're under 45, let me talk to you as well. Don't grow weary. Don't grow weary. And don't listen to us old duffers as we complain and whine and blame and build bomb shelters and stockpile food and just hope that Jesus comes and we get a Republican in office, all right? You know what I want you to do? Keep your eyes on Jesus and get out of social media. They don't know what they're talking about. Okay? That's not truth. That's not encouragement. Open your Word and read the Word and see what the Word has to say. Here's what I love about the Word. It's a history book that tells about the past and also tells about the future. And every time I read the history book, we come out winners. Yay! It's just great, right? That's where the encouragement is found. Now, as if we don't feel bad enough about ourselves and how small we pray and how small we think and how much fear we have, as if we don't feel bad enough about ourselves, the writer of Hebrews, he just kind of gets one more jab in there. In verse number 4, when he says this, after all, you have not yet given your lives in your struggle against sin. Yeah, you're right. Isn't it true for you? Isn't it true for me that none of us in this room have been martyred for our faith? Because if we had been, we wouldn't be in this room. I think we got it pretty good, don't you think so? I think we've got it pretty good. We have every reason to live fearless and never a reason to retreat in fear. Imagine a generation of Christians. Imagine a generation of Christians that lived fearlessly and decided, you know what, we can influence and impact the world. In fact, it happened once. And it happened with a group of people that was young, that decided enough is enough. I'm going to live fearlessly, anchored in Jesus. There's uncertainty is certain, but fear is going to be an absolute option. It doesn't matter who the president is. It doesn't matter what policies are in place. It doesn't matter what laws are enacted. It doesn't matter what signs are on the bathroom. God's in control of what's going on in the world, and I'm not going to retreat in fear. I'm going to influence the world. We're the seasoning agent. We're the church, and God has called us to do that. Christians, imagine if for a moment you could see the world being influenced by your fearlessness, and it can absolutely happen. Fearless. Fearless. And you know what? Why don't we just stop at the end of this sermon right now and just pray? God, I want to be a person of courage. Because uncertainty is certain, but fear is an option. And I will not be fearless because I'm keeping my eyes on Jesus.